It is the first sound of history, the first word, the first tax receipt, the first law, all captured in mud. What if everything you know, the city you live in, the way you measure time, the very stories you tell, all began in one place? 6,000 years ago, in the harsh crucible between two rivers, one people rose to invent the very blueprint for civilization. Welcome to Civilization Odyssey. Today we journey to the dawn of history, to meet the Sumerians. Our story begins here, not in Egypt, not in Greece, but in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, a volatile, unpredictable land. Today it is modern Iraq and Kuwait. 6 millennia ago, it was known as Sumer. To understand when the Sumerians emerged, we must look at the master timeline. This is the dawn of the Bronze Age. The Sumerians weren't just early, they were the first. While the first pharaohs were just beginning to unify the villages of the Nile, the Sumerians were already building the world's first true cities. The world of Sumer was a crucible of extremes. Their environment was not a gift, it was a challenge. To the south, endless reed marshes. To the north, dry, cracked earth. And binding it all, the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. But these rivers were not like the gentle, predictable Nile. They were violent, flooding catastrophically and without warning, washing away fields and homes. To survive here required more than courage. It required genius. The Sumerians engineered the first large-scale irrigation canals, taming the floods and turning the desert into a garden. And with this surplus, they built. They built with the only material they had in abundance, river mud. From this humble mud, they shaped their world. We fly through a commoner's home, a small, windowless courtyard, rooms for sleeping and grinding grain, flat roofs for sleeping on hot nights. Now, we rise. Above the neighborhoods, over the sprawling markets, to the heart of the city, the temple complex, and towering over all, the ziggurat, a man-made mountain of solid brick. This was not a tomb like the pyramids. It was a stairway to the heavens, a platform for the gods to descend to earth. Who were these city builders? Based on their own art, the Sumerians were a non-Semitic people, often depicted with large, arresting eyes and clean-shaven heads for priests and officials. Society was a rigid pyramid. At the top was the Lugal, the great man, or king, who acted as the god's representative on earth. Below him, the priests and priestesses who managed the god's lands. Then, the scribes, the vital bureaucracy, followed by artisans, merchants, farmers, and at the very bottom, slaves, often captured in war. What was daily life like? It was built on bread and beer. Children played with clay toys and board games, like the stunning royal game of a pastime for all classes. Trade was the lifeblood of the city, but this was a world before coins. Trade was barter, weighed in precise measures of silver, or, more commonly, barley. And in this world, your signature was not your name, it was your seal. All civilizations have a core strength. The Romans had the legion, the Egyptians, the Nile. The Sumerians' advantage wasn't a weapon or a river, it was an idea. Two ideas, in fact, that changed the human species forever. First, the city. This was not a large village, it was a revolutionary new way of living. A complex web of specialists, priests, bakers, soldiers, scribes, kings, all living together, protected by the world's first massive city walls. But how do you manage 50,000 people? How do you track taxes, store grain, and organize labor? You need their second and greatest invention, writing. It began not with poetry, but with accounting, a symbol for barley, a symbol for ration. But from these humble pictographs, an explosion of thought. The Sumerians gave us the first laws, the first schools, the Aduba, the first mathematics, and finally, the first great work of literature, the first hero's journey, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of a king obsessed with his own mortality. The Sumerians lived in a world alive with gods. They were polytheists, seeing divinity in the sky, the water, the storm, and the fields. These gods were not benevolent. They were powerful, human-like, and fickle, driven by lust, jealousy, and rage. Humans, they believed, were sculpted from clay for a single purpose: to be the slaves of the gods, to feed them, clothe them, and sing their praises. Failure meant chaos. The gods would abandon the city, and the rivers would either dry up or flood. Their religion was one of maintenance, of appeasement, and in death, there was no glorious afterlife. The Sumerian underworld was the land of no return, a bleak, shadowy realm, a house of dust, where the dead saw no light. The Sumerian world was one of constant, grinding conflict, not between empires, but between neighbors, city-state against city-state, Uruk versus Ur, Lagash versus Umma. They fought for water rights, for trade routes, and for the favor of the gods. This internal weakness left them vulnerable, and their great connection, their mortal enemy, would rise from among them. In 2334 BCE, Sargon of Akkad, a brilliant, ruthless warlord, did the unthinkable. He conquered them all. He forged the rival cities into the world's first empire, the Akkadian Empire. Sumerian independence was over. Sumer would have one last glorious rebirth, the third dynasty of Ur. But the end was near. Climate change, overfarming, and new waves of invaders, the Gutians, the Elamites, and the Amorites, brought the final collapse. By 2000 BCE, Sumer was gone. The Sumerian language died, becoming a dead language, replaced by Akkadian. But they did not vanish. They were absorbed. Their conquerors, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, all adopted Sumerian culture as their own. Their gods became their gods. Their myths, their mathematics, their writing, it all lived on. The immortal legacy of Sumer is civilization itself, the city, the law, the wheel, and history. They were the first to write their story down. The Sumerians are the first chapter in our shared human story. They remind us that even the greatest cities can turn to dust, forcing us to ask, what immortal legacy are we building today? Next time on Civilization Odyssey, the Sumerian story does not end. It is conquered. We trace the rise of the warlord who united the warring cities by fire and sword, forging the world's very first empire. We meet Sargon the Great and the Akkadians,